All right, let me continue by talking about multicultural rubble, and let me explain why I use the term. I'm going to use a lot of terms because this is, for those of you who are history majors, you're going to be taking historiography, and within historiography there is a direction called post-structuralism, and post-structuralism is very much concerned about language and the use of language. So I'm going to use the terms rubble. I already used the term Rabble, sounds the same, German accent, which is basically these riffraffs that supposedly joined the SS. But in this case, I like rubble because it really takes on two meanings towards the end of the war. The rubble that you actually find in German cities because of the constant bombardments by the Royal Air Force and the US Air Force. So you have lots and lots of rubble there. But you also have the contradictions and ultimate exhaustion of Nazi ideology, and especially in connection with this is racial ideology. Because if you take a closer look at these individuals, you would, from a Nazi perspective, actually argue that they shouldn't be in German uniform. Because these individuals are, according to Nazi ideology, racially inferior, not good fighters, not the same as Aryan Germans. However, the reality is such that by the time the war enters its final phase, after Stalingrad especially, you have no other choice but inviting these individuals in. And what I want to look at is why would somebody from South Asia actually considering fighting for the German army? Would you like to venture a guess? Yes?
Didn't the Nazis go to Tibet?
Yes, but these weren't troops that came from Tibet. These weren't, yes, you're absolutely right, yes, because the Nazis actually, here they found a great exemption because they could say, well, the original Aryans actually came from that area. You're absolutely right. But why would somebody from that region fight for the Nazis?
Could it be because they have an alliance with Japan?
Yes, but remember, India is all occupied by the British.
Right.
British India, yes, absolutely, yes.
Was it because of the previous British occupation?
Yes, that's very good. That's really the reason why, because the Germans promised that they will liberate you from the British. Well, we are actually, and this seemed ironic, but the Germans sell themselves as being anti-colonial. You know, I mean, when you invite all these concepts of Lebensraum, and that's when you see all these contradictions already appearing, the cracks, if you like, in Nazi ideology, because by the end of the war, that whole thing just collapses on itself. So let me go into greater detail. So that's why the two meanings, the rubble is the actual rubble that you find towards the end of the war, and that's of course where most of these forces will be fighting in, and the contradiction and ultimate exhaustion of Nazi ideology. So, and since you just mentioned it, you know, again, I cringe when I say Nazi multiculturalism, but, you know, and don't misunderstand me, because some people sometimes misunderstand me in this, and Bushman hates multiculturalism. No, okay? I think multiculturalism is a wonderful idea, okay? So, and it's something that we have as a major pillar here in this university. However, multiculturalism can be sometimes distorted. It can be misused. And in the case of Nazi Germany, we encounter such an example. So, Nazi multiculturalism, and I put it in scare quotes, I put it in quotation marks, because the Nazis are multicultural. I think after we studied the Holocaust and the racial ideology, well, I would even argue that the Nazis are not really concerned about culture, because they believe everything is genetically determined. So genetics trumps culture.
Well, for the Nazis, culture and genetics are the same. It's that your thing about, that quote you had about that racism, the thing about culture being determined. What was
Yes.
that? I can't remember exactly.
Yeah, it's racism is the belief that cultures have natures.
Right. So that would be, I mean, that's how the Nazis would think about
Absolutely.
culture.
So when I put multiculturalism up there, I want you to keep in mind that is a little bit tongue-in-cheek, because the Nazis are not multicultural. Interestingly enough, though, if you go to YouTube, and I encourage you to do so, pull up foreign volunteers in the Waffen-SS, and you will have all these right-wing, I don't know how to call them, all these right-wing individuals trying to argue that the Nazis really weren't really as bad because they allowed other cultures into the ranks. Okay, and that's why this lecture is much needed, because it provides a little bit of contextualization. When you stumble across these YouTube videos, you watch them with extreme caution. Okay.
Yeah, and they were tolerant of other cultures in the sense that the other cultures were appropriate for people who were going to be their slaves.
Right.
Right?
Very good. So in order to understand the willingness, let's say Nazi multiculturalism is very controlled, in a sense that the Nazis were allowing other cultures to join the Waffen-SS and to join the German fighting units, but really there's a reason for it. And the main reason is the winter of 1941-1942. A lot of things happened. That's of course also we have seen the beginning of the Holocaust, right? The conspiracy movie takes place in January of 1942, but it's also a shock for the German armed forces. And what we also see after the winter of 1941-1942 is that casualty numbers in Germany will go up at an alarming rate. At such an alarming rate, and this comes back to what Dr. Norris said, that death notices of soldiers will no longer be printed in newspapers. That's why you get these death cards that Dr. Norris talked about. And also you need to replace them. So there's the need to somehow replace these individuals who have fallen. So you need to start recruiting. Not just within Germany, because Germany has limited human resources. I'll talk about this too. The last soldiers fighting, and you've seen images of this, are sometimes age 14. Right? Limited resources that you have within Germany, you can stretch them, but at one point you need to go outside of Germany. So who would you appeal to? I mean, clearly you wouldn't appeal to anybody by saying, well, you'll be fighting for Nazi Germany. Then everybody would say, well, sorry, but you're on your own. But you appeal to them, let's say within Europe, and we've already seen this to some extent, you basically tell the people, look, we have a common aim. We are fighting the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union is evil. Communism is evil. Bolshevism is evil. And if you join us, if you believe in your country, and this might not be Germany, but it could be France, you could be a French patriot, then you see that we have a common aim. We're trying to stop the expansion of the Soviet Union, the expansion of communism. Join us. And that was actually very convincing. It would recruit a lot of people by appealing to this common denominator. You've already said it. The other population that they would, there's a big irony here, appeal to populations that live under colonial rule. Indians who live under British rule. Southeast Asians who live under French rule. The Germans would fight, probably know this, in North Africa. North Africa were independent countries like they are now. But Libya was Italian, Tunisia was French, Algeria was French, Morocco was French, Egypt was British. So appeal to these people living there and say, we can liberate you from the British. Of course, there's a big irony. The irony is that the Nazis were extremely colonialist, but they were more concerned about creating colonies adjacent to Germany, not colonies in Africa. So they could make that promise that we give you some sort of independence. Again, it was never clearly said what kind of independence that would be. I'm sure that if the Germans would have been victorious in North Africa, they would have not given the Moroccans, the Tunisians, the Libyans, or the Egyptians any sort of autonomy. but you can put it out there. And therefore convince these people who are living under colonial rule to join the Germans. And last one, that's perhaps the darkest one. And I'll talk about this. You actually have a lot of Muslims who would join the Germans, where you would say, Muslims join German? I don't understand. Yes?
Yeah, those colonies in like Africa were fighting in German time. And I was just going to say it's strange because during World War II, those colonies had to fight next to the, for the control of the colonies.
Right. You bring out a big colonization. You didn't have much of a choice. If you, the Germans were fighting mostly in North Africa, but there were colonial troops, as they were in World War I. Shameless plug for our class, because we're going to talk about that, who were pressed into uniform, especially in West Africa, places like the Gold Coast, Ghana, Senegal. They would just take troops out and send them to fight. There were a lot of colonial troops that the Germans captured. So.
And the English too, right?
And the English too. Yes, English too used a lot of colonial troops too, especially Indians, especially from India. And part of this has to do with the sort of notion that there exist martial cultures. Let me explain that. There are cultures out there in the world that are more militant. The Gurkhas in British India, for instance, are seen as these manly individuals that you can draft, put into uniform, and there's this major stereotype that's still propelled by it. So colonial troops were still pressed into uniform, and especially you will see this, and I'll get to this, the fighting in North Africa, where the Germans were fighting with the Italians against the British, mostly British, later the Americans, but mostly British, and the British would use all kinds of colonial troops.
What I'm saying is these people were fighting for Germany, but they're like people they took from the army that they captured, or like people that they like, because they knew those, like, the people from those countries, they had to fight for the people who were colonized.
Sure.
And one of them is like, well, were they like killing them or taking them?
Sure. I'll talk about that, I promise. Repeat that question again at the end of this lecture, please. Because obviously the Germans had colonies in World War I. So they actually used colonial troops in World War I. But in World War II, Germany had no colonies. But they were occupying a very narrow strip of land in North Africa. First, because they had invaded France in 1940, so they had taken over places like Morocco, Tunisia, and of course Libya was Italian, so they were allied with the Italians, and then they tried to invade Egypt, which was British. So, and that's where most of the fighting took place. Weren't the Germans initially using indigenous population? To my knowledge, I would say no. But as soon as the war turned against them in North Africa, they were appealing to the colonial population. Does that answer your question? But bring it up again, because I'm going to try to do more explaining on this and provide you with particular examples from North Africa as well as India.
It's kind of a stretch question, but do you think also the reason why these the Muslim communities and Hindu communities were kind of fighting with Germany because of Winston Churchill's kind of position on what he thought about Muslim and Hindus?
Yes, there clearly was. I'll get to that as well, because it's all related to an individual we have forgotten. His name is Chandra Bose, and he was a contemporary of Mahatma Gandhi. And unlike Mahatma Gandhi, he would say peaceful marches is not the solution. You have to do active resistance to the colonists. Something that Mahatma Gandhi rejected. This guy basically said, well, the enemy of my enemy is my friend, right? And that has a lot to do with this as well. I'll get to that in a second, I promise. Islamic connection, however, is the darkest one. Because, again, you have to be careful of what you see on YouTube because they sometimes made the connection between the Nazis and militant Islam, especially ISIS. And, I would say a lot of contextualization needed. But the reason why the Nazis were able to recruit Muslims is because of the common anti-Semitism. Muslims believed that, for instance, Jewish immigration to the Holy Land was bad and needed to be stopped. And so that's why they started recruiting from there. And I'll talk more about that as well. So, let me talk about the very first one. I'm going to do this rather quickly. This is an example of how the Nazis tried to sell their idea to the rest of Europe. The crusade against Bolshevism. You've seen this poster before. So again, showing all these different nations coming together as one to stop the threat from the East. And you see also the Nazis are very skilled in propaganda. We talked about this. One thing that the Nazis were very good at is connecting their mission to whatever the country's history is. Look at this, for instance. This is a Norwegian recruiting poster for the Waffen-SS. And you see in the background the Viking ships, right? So connecting the SS campaign with the Viking history of the Norwegians. This one is a little bit more difficult to see, but here you have the Waffen-SS connecting themselves to Dutch history. And what you have here is the Dutch East India Company, the greatest accomplishment of the Dutch, sailing out in the wide world. Again, supposedly the campaign in the East connects to Dutch history. So, connecting the individual history with the common cause. So there are, a couple other examples. Here we have Bosnian units, and I'll get back to these because these are the Muslims. Again, the common cause, destroying the Soviet Union. Here again, these are, I think this is also Norwegian, shows the strength of the Norwegians, especially when it comes to winter fighting, something that the Germans, of course, learned the hard way. And these are Estonians, some of the biggest units that would fight for the Waffen-SS would be individuals from the Baltic Republic, because shortly before the Germans invaded the Soviet Union, the Baltic republics were forcefully taken over by Stalin. So they were saying, sure, we'll join you. But again, not necessarily because we believe the Russians to be racially inferior. We want to establish an independent Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. Some of my favorite are these, and Dr. Norris already showed you these. Create a St. George division. This was initially envisioned, these are individuals from Great Britain. This was initially envisioned after the German invasion in 1940, that of course never came. And later on, these poor guys were recruited in POW camps. And Dr. Norris, there's a great documentary about this called The Britons Who Fought for Hitler. And it's on YouTube, you can watch that. There's about a very small unit that came together, maybe 30 or so, that were pressed into uniform. And, poor guys, they were placed in April of 1945 right in front of the Soviet army. Not a good place to be. So, coming back to your question, anti-colonialism. When things went bad in North Africa, and they started going bad really in the summer of 1942, the Germans are marching forward, but ultimately their supply lines are extremely stretched, and they come to a grinding halt in a major decisive battle in Egypt, known as El Alamein. You probably heard about that. That's when Montgomery and the British 8th Army stops Rommel's advance, and the Germans are slowly pushed back. To make matters worse, in November of 1942, the Americans land for the first time fighting forces in North Africa, in particular in Morocco and Algeria. The Germans are, of course, really upset about this. They're upset about this because the French really don't do very little to oppose the American landing. So that's when the Germans are really between a rock and a hard place, because you have the British pressing from Egypt and the Americans pressing from Morocco, and ultimately all the German and Italian troops pushed into beachhead, and that's Tunisia. So the Germans are desperate to increase their numbers. Supplies are very difficult to get in because they have to be brought in over the Mediterranean. Men in short supply. So you start to create a new unit. This unit is known as the Free Arabia Unit. A very weird unit, because the North Africans are really not Arabia. But again, you know, for the Nazis, it's basically the same thing. Muslims, right? They're all Muslims. So, and the promise that the Nazis made for the individuals living in Tunisia is, if you join this unit, the Free Arabia Unit, then you can join us as we are liberating all of North Africa, and ultimately we're going to push into the Middle East, and we liberate that too, from the French and the British. Apparently, you would think somebody who has a good knowledge of the military situation would be hard-pressed to join the Germans, but we do have examples of individuals from North Africa wearing this patch. This, by the way, I should emphasize, is not an SS unit, but it's a unit that is affiliated with the common infantry. And they would wear this patch. Sometimes you find a patch like this on eBay, it runs several $1,000s. Very rare. If you find it for less than that, don't buy it, because it's clearly a fake. And there are a lot of fakes out there. My favorite is always when you find these postings on eBay and it comes from some sort of military museum in the Ukraine that has just closed down and is now selling all of its gear. Fake. Okay? Fake. It's a Free Arabia. The best known one is also connected to the campaign in North Africa, and that is the Free India Division that initially was attached to the German armed forces, but was ultimately joined into, and this is my favorite, joined into the Waffen-SS. Why do you have a Free India Division? And that goes back to the questions that all of you have. Well, first, where do these individuals come from? Well, some of you have mentioned there are all these expeditions going to Tibet. These expeditions didn't return any individuals to Germany. However, as the Germans were fighting in North Africa, they captured a lot of Indian troops, especially during one of the major battles taking place in North Africa, the Battle of Tobruk. Don't need to remember that. Thousands of Indians came into German captivity. As these individuals were brought to Germany, there was in Germany an individual who had left India. He had to leave India. His name is Chandra Bose. And he had joined Hitler and the Nazis because they had promised Chandra Bose that they will help him liberate India from the British. I mentioned already this earlier. Chandra Bose was a contemporary of Mahatma Gandhi. We know, of course, everything about Mahatma Gandhi, but we don't know much about this guy. Mahatma Gandhi was somebody advocating passive resistance and advocating non-violence. Chandra Bose said that's nonsense. If we truly want independence for India, we have to fight. We have to take on arms, and we have to look at who is the enemy of the British. The Nazis, the Germans. Make a coalition with them. So Chandra Bose was actually given an office. It's interesting. He had an Austrian wife, married, and took an interest to all these troops, the POWs, that were brought to Germany. And of course there was major contradiction initially, especially as individuals saying, well, listen guys, these are Indians. The whole Nazi ideology contradicted using these troops. But then of course somebody had the great idea, as Dr. Volkan already pointed out, that, wait a minute, they are the true Aryans. You know, they're not German Aryans, okay, they're not blonde and blue-eyed, we can't push it that far, but they're the original Aryans. So we can actually put them in uniforms and we're fighting for the same cause. Oh, weird stuff. I'm sorry. Yeah, well, that's when this whole multicultural rubble becomes very obvious, because you start stretching your ideology to such an extent that it's wafer thin. It just basically wears itself out. The other thing is what Chandra Bose was very hopeful that the Germans would succeed in the Soviet Union. Initially, he didn't like the invasion of the Soviet Union because Chandra Bose had also seen Stalin as an ally. He was looking at everybody who would fight the British. He was hoping that Stalin would. But once the Germans invaded, he said, okay, well, I'm going to look at this. But then after Stalingrad, Chandra Bose said, probably not good to work with the Nazis. So he said, could you take me to Southeast Asia? And the Germans did. They gave him a U-boat. They took him all the way to into the Indian Ocean, where he was picked up by a Japanese U-boat and taken to Southeast Asia. And there Chandra Bose worked with the Japanese. Why with the Japanese? Because the Japanese had occupied most of Southeast Asia, and in Southeast Asia you have a sizable Indian community. And from this Indian community, Chandra Bose started recruiting, and the last major offensive that the Japanese undertook in 1944 was an invasion of India, led mostly by Chandra Bose's troops. Cut a long story short, that invasion was unsuccessful. Ultimately, Chandra Bose dies in a very mysterious plane crash. Right after the war is over, there's suspicion of foul play. So he dies in August of 1945. What happened to the poor Indians who were pressed into German uniform? Well, after Chandra Bose left, the sort of reason to have joined the German army was gone as well. So the German army used them, but they didn't have much use for them, so they handed them over to the Waffen-SS. Heinrich Himmler went weird, but he said, fine, you know, we need troops. So they basically used them to patrol mostly the Dutch coast. You know, the invasion was about to begin. Nobody knew where the American and British troops were landing, so they put them first in the Netherlands, because that's where they said, they were relatively safe. And there are a lot of really interesting documentaries, unfortunately all in Dutch, that are made about this, because the Dutch really loved these guys, because they were willing to share their food. I mean, you have to understand that the European population under German occupation was starving. You know, they were having a hard time. And these guys, for them, sharing was important. So you share. We share with the children, you share with the others. So they became very much integrated into the Dutch society. Dutch society really remembers them very fondly. Well, the Germans were kind of said, well, you there, we found your purpose, but yeah. So ultimately, what happened, and it's very sad, is when D-Day finally happened, on June 6, 1944, these guys were pulled out of the Netherlands and were literally thrown into the meat grinder of what is northern France. The Indian troops were used as cannon fodder to stop American and British and Canadian troops, and finally saw the light. So they deserted and tried to make their way to Switzerland, because that was the only destination you could. They were intercepted and handed over to the British. Many of these troops would serve long prison sentences after the war, and some were even executed by the British. So hence ends that chapter of free India. Fortunately, there's a different chapter that has nothing to do with Bose under the heading of Mahatma Gandhi that would ultimately be successful of bringing independence to India. Let's switch gears to the Muslims, because this is another weird thing. Muslims fighting for the Nazis.
Yeah.
Again, the Nazis are scrambling. The year is 1942, and they're looking for allies wherever they can find them. One of their allies is a very particular radical Islamic scholar, the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem. His name is Amin al-Husseini. Amin al-Husseini. Notice that he lives still almost 20 years after the war. He would inspire the Palestinian Liberation Organization, also known as the PLO. Yasser Arafat is one of his relatives. So there is this sort of radical Islam component working together with Nazi Germany, but we have to be very careful and contextualize this. Amin al-Husseini, as the highest Islamic religious authority in Jerusalem, called for active resistance against the English who occupied Jerusalem. The reason why he called for active resistance is because he felt that the British were allowing too many Jewish individuals to move into the Holy Land and thereby displacing the original Muslim population. Because he called for active resistance, the British were after him, tried to arrest him, but he got out. He got out and he fled first to Italy, and from there he ended up in Berlin very quickly, where through the German foreign minister Ribbentrop, he actually got an audience with Hitler. Hitler actually spoke to him. He met with Amin al-Husseini, and al-Husseini basically said, your interest and my interest are the same. We both hate the Jews. We both want to get rid of the Jews. Let's work together. The first thing that the Germans did is they gave al-Husseini access to the radio. So this in several of the news radios. The Germans had very powerful radio installations. So they allowed him to basically go on the air and speak in Arabic, where he was allowed to declare a holy war against the Western powers and the Jews on the open air. By the way, Chandra Bose, who I showed you earlier, was also allowed to go on the air, and basically in Hindi he would send messages over to India encouraging the Indians to rise up against the British overlords. But that was not enough. Al-Husseini would be also used to recruit Muslims. By the time al-Husseini was established in Germany, the war in North Africa was over. To cut a long story short, by May of 1943, all Italian and German units still fighting surrendered to the Americans and British. So, no more Muslims, because the Germans and the Italians are cut off from North Africa, but there is a sizable Muslim, in some cases majority, living still under German control. Where? Don't say Turkish in Germany, because that is post-World War II development. There weren't that many before 1945. In 1941, German troops, before the invasion of the Soviet Union, in the spring of 1941, take over a country that no longer exists by the name of Yugoslavia. Yugoslavia is a multi-ethnic state. The legacy really of Yugoslavia comes from the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and the Austro-Hungarian Empire always fought with the Ottomans, the current Turks. Because of this, the Turks actually made it into what is today Yugoslavia and established Muslim communities, especially in places, probably heard about them, such as Kosovo, Bosnia-Herzegovina, and Albania. Okay, these are all, there are sizable pockets. In Albania, they're even a majority. So so they talked to Husseini, this is 1943, and they talked to Husseini and said, could you help us create Muslim divisions for the Waffen-SS? Al-Husseini said, sure, let's do that. And by early 1944, he created the 13th Waffen-Gebirgsdivision, that means mountain division. These are basically individuals who fight in the mountains. Probably would call them also Alpine division. These are individuals who are specialized fighting in mountainous regions. It is known as the Hanscha. And the Hanscha is basically an Ottoman sword. It's an Ottoman sword that became the symbol for this particular division. In order to raise these divisions, though, a couple of things needed to be done. Muslims in the racial hierarchy, Dr. Volkan already talked about that, not very high. So Himmler sent a physician to examine Al-Husseini and found, well, Al-Husseini isn't really Muslim, he's really Aryan. So again, contradiction. Not all Muslims, and they created a new category. Sorry about that. They basically, in German, a Muslim is called a Musulmane. Okay? So they created what is known as the Musulgermane, which is the Muslim German. And so these units were declared to be really partially Aryan. They weren't like the rest of the Muslims, but these are really good Muslims. These fit in the racial categorization, and they fit to serve in the Waffen-SS. Even if Himmler was reluctant, he was ultimately convinced by this. Convinced by science. Because the scientists went in there, measured skulls and said, no, they're really Aryan. They're Musulgermane. They're these different categories. They're the forgotten cousins of us.
That's great.
When you think about it, it just gets too ridiculous. But here is the other kicker. The Waffen-SS units are known for not being very religious. And Dr. Volkan showed you this, Dr. Norris showed you this. There are very few pictures where you actually see church service in German uniforms. And the Waffen-SS was taught not to have church services. So there were no religious experts following the Waffen-SS. Exception was made for this division. Religious experts, Muslim religious experts, were allowed to be part of these units, and they were given dispensation to pray 5 times to Mecca. Al-Husseini didn't stop there, but created another mountain division, the 21st Waffen Mountain Division, known as the Skenderbeg Division. These were all Albanians. I should say this again. The 13th Division was mostly Bosnians. The 21st Division, mostly Albanians. The name Skenderbeg comes from an Albanian hero. Again, that was what they were carrying on their uniforms. What about these divisions? And again, when you go on YouTube, you see all these wonderful things about the Nazis were multicultural. But keep in mind why these divisions were created. Did they see much fighting on the Eastern Front? The answer is no. But they were used where they were needed most, fighting partisans in Yugoslavia. You probably have heard of Tito, who was organizing the resistance against, he would ultimately rule Yugoslavia at the end of the war. At Tito's death, Yugoslavia would fall apart. But Tito was fighting the Germans, so they needed these units to hunt down partisans. Were they great units? Well, we know that they committed a lot of atrocities, especially against Jews. The majority of these individuals who would ultimately fall into the hand of the partisans were given no pardons, were immediately executed. We only recently have accounts about this. There was an excellent documentary made about these troops. Unfortunately, it's only in German and French, but it's basically called The Swastika and the Turban. Excellent. I hope it will ultimately have subtitles. But we will know more about this, because there is also historians who write about this, and it's better than the crap that you get on YouTube. Okay? There's nothing noble about these individuals. There's nothing wonderful about the Nazis of letting these individuals in. It's basically, stretching racial ideology to such an extent that it almost collapses on itself. Let me just say, there is also a documentary made by the History Channel, and that needs to be watched very carefully. Because the argument here is made that radical Islam, as you see it today, is all the result from this. That's not entirely true. However, the connection between the Middle East and Nazis is such, we always think that all the Nazis, such as Mengele, go to South America. There were many Nazi doctors who actually found refuge in places like Egypt. There is a connection there, but it shouldn't be overemphasized. For instance, I don't believe there's any connection between this and ISIS. Some people like to see the genocidal actions of ISIS being the continuation of this. And there you have to be very careful.
Reiner, can I say something?
Yeah.
About this? And one thing you can't underestimate is, a lot of these people were under English rule in the Middle East. And the English were not very nice. And in fact, you talked about gas attacks and things like this, and the English, after World War I, did gas attacks on, I think they were either Saudis or some of these tribes, in the Middle East. And the English, the first civilian targets to be bombed, as far as we know, using air power, were the British bombing Muslim peoples in these places to subdue the whole villages. They had actually bombed the village, including the women and the children in the houses and stuff like that. Sure. And so there was a lot of tremendous hatred for the British, in the Muslim world.
There was a little bit also the connection about, and this is not entirely true, there was the notion that the British had unchecked allowing everybody in. And that's not true, because the British had very tight restrictions on who was going to come in and out.
Well, later on, that gets after the war.
After the war, but in the 30s and 40s, it was not so. But it was frequently understood. There's even Al-Husseini, and again, grain of salt here, but Al-Husseini became aware. Go back here. Became aware of an attempt by Eastern European powers to take Jews from Romania, Hungary, and allow them to move to the Middle East. And he blocked that and had these same Jews taken to Auschwitz. So, there's anti-Semitism, but there's also the hatred against the British, and to that should be added now a fierce hatred of the Americans, because they will become a major power. That's why when you contextualize this, yes, the British hatred goes further back. The conflict between Jews and Muslims is something that also goes back, but it's also the current situation of the United States. I wanted to come back to your question. Is that now answered? About your question about the colonial troops? These were mostly from a very small part of Africa, and mostly the northern part. I mean, the Germans didn't have any ability to get to, let's say, colonial populations in sub-Saharan Africa. They did in World War I, because the Germans had colonies in Togo, Southwest Africa, East Africa, and I'm forgetting Cameroon. So that's different. If you're interested in that, World War I class, we'll talk about that. So we still have an open slot Wednesdays night. Shameless plug. So yes. All right. Where was I? Yes. We talked about the sort of contradictions that emerge in the Nazi ideology. How the Nazi ideology had to be stretched to such an extent that almost it collapses on itself. I want to talk a little bit about the end, because here's another irony. Many of you have told me you have watched the movie Downfall, the last few. Yes.
I was.
Very good movie. Something that doesn't appear in the movie very well is that among the great majority of the defenders who making the last stand outside of Hitler's bunkers are not German. They are actually foreign volunteers. Most of them deriving, that's why the History Channel has this documentary that says 200 Muslims were fighting, but I can't find any reference to that. So, but we do know that there were members from the Charlemagne Division, the 33rd SS Division, and the 11th SS Division. Nordland, as the name indicates, is made up mostly of Scandinavians, Swedes, Danes, Norwegians. What to make of this is interesting, because when you go on YouTube and you do a random search and enter 33rd Division Charlemagne, you will find The Last Heroes of Berlin, a documentary made by extreme right-wing individuals who see these guys as heroes. In their own country, whether it's France, Denmark, Sweden, wherever they're coming from, they're not seen as heroes, they're seen as outcasts, as crazy guys, as rubble.
Are they seen as traitors?
Yes, very much as traitors. And I'll talk a little bit about that, because I'm going to talk about some of these individuals. Many of the individuals who were captured and turned over to their home countries, some were immediately killed, some spent long prison terms. Yes, traitors. But I want to also introduce the last category, rubble. Okay? Not actual rubble in the streets, but individuals who have lost everything, in a sense that whatever moral center they have inside has collapsed on them. They have become expended human beings, literally rubble. So let me talk a little bit about these. The pictures need some contextualization. These are some of the last pictures of Charlemagne individuals outside of the Chancery in Berlin. This is a picture taken after the Battle of Berlin, which shows a half track. The sign right here, this is the sign of the Nordland Division that you see outside. Again, Dr. Norris reminds us of how watching these pictures is like bird watching. You can tell a lot for them. This half track probably tried to break the encirclement of the Russians, was shut down, and you see what happened to the individuals. The end is not glorious. Especially, I encourage you to keep that thought when you're watching all these documentaries about how these guys are really heroes and how they defended Europe at the gates of Berlin. And interesting, we know a little bit, unfortunately, again, in order to find out more about this guy, I have to go into right-wing websites, because he's sometimes seen as the sort of champions of Nazi multiculturalism. His name is Lucien Keramat. He's supposedly still alive. He lives in Thailand today. And as far as we know, he had a Thai father and a French mother. Whether he is Thai, it's not entirely clear, because the little I know from these, and I try to read these websites, and the problem with websites is they constantly quote each other. That's why taking stuff from the internet, you have to be very careful, because nobody, instead citing each other, and nobody really cites anything in concrete. That's why very careful what you get from the internet. Keramat, the name Keramat is probably from an ethnic group that lives in the borderland of Thailand and Cambodia. So it's not entirely clear whether he's Thai or Cambodian. Again, in the past, these differences didn't make any sense, because these borders were erected by colonial powers. So Lucien grew up in France. He was discriminated against by Frenchmen, French women. When the German invaded in 1940, he found that the Germans were kinder to him than the actual Frenchmen. So he decided to join the German army initially in 1941 as they were moving into Russia, and fought there with distinction. This is a picture we have of him holding an MG-42. You know what it is now after Dr. Norris's lecture. So, and this is fantastic. I wish I could read this, but he wrote his memoirs. Unfortunately, it's only available in Thai, and that's a language I have absolutely no idea, and it's hard to find translators. But something tells me, just by the cover where he's shown there in uniform, in Nazi uniform, that he really has no regrets of having fought for the Germans. He ultimately would join the Charlemagne division, the one I showed you earlier, the 33rd SS division, and would fight in the east, in some of the last battles in the east, where he would be injured. The injury was fortunate for Karamat because he was allowed to go back to France and did not join the rest of the 33rd division as they were desperately trying to defend Adolf Hitler's bunker. There, he suffered some discrimination, but as far as we can tell, he wasn't interned or anything, but ultimately left France and is now settled in Thailand. I don't know how the story continues. Again, I wish I would have access to this particular book. Most of the information I've just been telling you come from right-wing websites that glorify him and see him as this sort of champion and showing that the Germans aren't really racist, but accepting again. So I think the story is interesting in the sense that here we have somebody that finds an opportunity. He is a good example of one of these individuals that didn't necessarily buy into the anti-colonial rhetoric, probably wasn't convinced of the Nazi racial ideology either, and fortunately for him, he managed to get out before the end came. Let me talk about some individuals that didn't make it out before the end came. Especially individuals, again, these are members of the Nordland division trying to get out, but there's also the very sad story of about 12 soldiers from the Charlemagne division who make it out of the Soviet encirclement of Berlin, are captured by the Americans, who immediately realize that these are Frenchmen, so they hand them over to a French military unit led by General Leclerc. Don't need to remember her name. And General Leclerc walks up to these guys and basically berates them. Says, you should be ashamed of yourself. You are the worst of everything that you can. Look at you. And then he says at the end of his whole tirade against them, he said, why are you wearing a German uniform? And one of the soldiers looked at him and he said, why are you wearing an American? And Leclerc gets so irate that he basically just interrupts this discussion, turns away and says, shoot them. So all 12 were executed on the spot. Again, I'm not trying to defend these guys. They made bad choices under many ways, but it's one of these examples of what happened to these individuals towards the end. And I'm going to show you a little bit of a documentary where some of these individuals who are now in quite advanced age have been interviewed in the early 2000s about their experiences, and you see a little bit of both. You see that heroism coming through again, that we fought against the Russians outside of Berlin because we were defending France. On the other hand, there's also the shame of having fought for this terrible ideology. So let me throw this for you, and then we can talk about it. I want to also say that most of these images, perfect. The last heroes of the 33 Waffen-SS Grenadier Division. European Watchmen 2. Right? Just to show you that some of the segments you're going to see, people are using this for sinister purposes. So that's why I went back to the original documentary. It was a documentary made about the actual Waffen-SS. So, let me play for you.
Man hat seine Pflicht zu tun bis zum Letzten.
A powerful Nazi delusion. Berlin was being destroyed by the Russian guns, but still the Waffen-SS were resisting. Some of them held to a perverse idea of defending Europe.
Und da haben wir wirklich Gewissensbisse gehabt. Sollen wir nun unsere Leute sagen, hau ab und geht nach Hause, oder müssen wir noch so einige Tage standhalten? Und wir haben getan, was von uns verlangt wurde. Wir haben bis zum letzten Tag Deutschland verteidigt eigentlich, weil wir glaubten, dadurch Europa verteidigen zu müssen und zu können.
The Waffen-SS also fought it out in Berlin to prolong their Führer's life, even just for a few days.
Ein erheblicher Prozentsatz der letzten Verteidiger der Reichskanzlei, der Russe war ja, was wie ich raus bin, auf 800 Meter an die Reichskanzlei rangekommen. Das waren zum großen Teil gar keine Deutschen. Das waren, zum großen Teil waren es Skandinavier, es waren Schweden, Dänen, glaube auch Franzosen.
The irony of history. By the end, there were hardly any Germans left in the elite Teutonic Guard protecting Hitler. One of the last defenders in the center of Nazi power was a Frenchman.
Wir dachten, wir gar nicht am Tod. Gar nicht. Nur kämpfen. Weiter kämpfen. Wir lebten, kämpften nur, zu kämpfen.
A prisoner of his own delusions.
Treu bis zum Ende. Treu bis zum Ende.
The end came behind these walls. In the bunker under his Reich Chancellery, Hitler withdrew from responsibility. His suicide left the Waffen-SS in limbo.
Es fehlte sozusagen der Mittelpunkt. Es fehlte die Kraft, die uns alle vorwärts getrieben hatte. Und wir hatten Angst vor dem, was kommen würde.
The River Elbe, April 1945. Thousands of German soldiers were fleeing from the Red Army, including men.
I don't know, what do you think about these three guys? I mean, there's clearly an attempt to define yourself as having done the right thing, but when I look at Henri Ferré, he breaks down. You know, on one hand he says loyal to the end, but then he can't look in a camera no more because he has truly become rubble. He probably at this late stage of his life realizes that he has fallen victim to an ideology that has basically spent his life. Henri Ferré, again to mention him, spent decades afterwards in prison, as condemned as a traitor. Some would say that he was luckier than the 12 Frenchmen who were captured by the Free French, but I don't know. I'll leave you with that thought.